Die Diaspora spricht.
Parlando.
Diasporas reden.
Falando. Diasporas de parler.
Diaspora spreekt.
Diasporas speaking.
My name is Rina Limoni, and I'm the host of Diasporas Speaking. In this podcast, together with our guests, we will explore the journeys, activism, and academic developments concerning Kosovo, Albanian, and Balkan diasporas to attain a deeper understanding of our communities scattered around the globe. In this episode, I will speak to Jonë Zhitia about her essay Nadryw, Sprache, fühlen, and explore how language becomes a mirror of the experience of migrants, refugees, and their children. Jonë Zhitia is a student of sociology and literary writing at the University of Leipzig and the German Literature Institute. In 2020, she co-founded the sustainable and feminist online magazine EKOLOGISKA MAG and contributes to jetzt, among other publications. Jon's work has appeared in literary magazines such as Jani, Akzente, Hansa Verlag, and the US publication The Common. In 2022, she was awarded the Wortmeldungen Förderpreis by the Ulrike Crespo Foundation for her essay Nadryw, Feeling Language, published by socio-cultural in June 2023. This year, Jonë received a stipend to work on her first novel and is currently a writer in residence in Goslar. Përshëndetje Jona, and welcome to Diasporas Speaking.
Tonkrina, thank you so much for letting me be here, and I was very excited for your invitation.
So just to break the ice, can you tell us a little bit about yourself? Where are you from in Kosovo? Where did you grow up? And what do you do in your day-to-day? And because we are Diasporas Speaking, what makes you think about diasporas?
I was born in Munich and raised there as well until I was like 10. Then we moved to a small Bavarian city called Dengdorf. The older I get, the more I realize that there is a big difference whether you are raised in like a small town in Bavaria or in a big city somewhere else in Germany. When I was younger, I didn't realize how big the differences within the country could be. My parents, this is so funny because you know in Kosovo how they ask you "E kuj na je," which like translates to whose are you, I guess? And usually you say dad's family, right? But I always, because also Zhitia is my mother's last name, I always just say I'm Sadete Zhitias. Until I grew up, I didn't realize that people expected me to say my dad's family. And also because most of our summer holidays we spent in Luga, which is by Podujiev, where my mom grew up and where my mom's family is. Because my dad's family, they were originally from Miloshev, but most of them emigrated or like fled. So my grandma lived alone in a small city apartment in Pristina. And especially when we were younger, there wasn't a big alert to stay locked in a small apartment in the city. So we spent most of our time in the countryside with my mom's family. So yeah, that's where I'm from. Well, now I live in Leipzig. Right now I'm in Goslar, actually, a small town in West Germany where I got a stipend. It's a residency to write on my first novel. But most of the time I live in Leipzig, which is a town I love a lot. I really do. But lately we just had elections for the state on Sunday, and it's so hard to explain, but like 30% are right-wing extremists now. And then the coalition that will happen will probably contain Bündnis Sarah Wagenknecht, which is the leftist party in theory, but also is authoritarian. So we will have a county government, like a state government, which has at least one authoritarian party, and also the CDU there, which is supposed to be the conservative party, is not so conservative. They have slipped to the right so much, and it's really troubling to see that that city I love, that I've been in for like 10 years, that I made my home, where I've worked in, where I did so much activism, where I did so much volunteer work, is becoming prey to fascists. And it makes me very upset. Especially on Saturday, we went to the CSD, the Christopher Street Parade in Zwickau, which is a small town nearby. And We were like, there were so many Nazis there. And when I say Nazis, I'm not like saying, oh, conservative people that are annoying, but I mean like proper neo-Nazis who had flags, who had signs, who had t-shirts on, which stated very much that they wanted us dead. And I think we don't talk enough about how disturbing it is to be surrounded by people who want you dead, and how suffocating and horrible that is to live a day-to-day life knowing that a third of the people in the county you live in want you dead. So there's that, to start the conversation on a really happy note.
I would say troublesome as a soft word to describe the current political landscape in Germany. Not only Sachsen, but also to see how the AfD is continuously growing in polls, currently placed at 20% Germany-wide. And I think I would say it's alarming, considering also that this is happening less than 100 years after the Holocaust. It is also unsettling to know how in Germany that is met with silence and with, as we say, as if there is a surprise in this, without reflection to how politically Germany reached this stage. And then, as you said, there is also this side, navigating these spaces as an ever-produced other, places one in a continuous struggle with society and oneself, because you are saying, I was born here and been living here my entire life, but on the other hand, I have to fear my existence in these spaces.
Also, like, as you said, there is this weird German thing that when fascists rise, the question is not how to fight them, but it's how to accommodate them. It's never like, how can we stop racists? How can we stop fascists? It's always like, how can we bring them back? And it's really frustrating to be like, especially when we were on the parade, the police was circling us nonstop. There was a helicopter, because the reason for this is that they were afraid someone was going to get brutalized or murdered. That's the type of people we're talking about.
And I think in Germany, there is a conception that Nazism and fascism are constructs of the past. And with this mindset, current racist experiences remain invisible or are a product of, as they say, Einzelfälle, which inevitably emboldens the far right and navigates away from critically assessing their crimes. So this intentional ongoing erasure, which then for those perceived as others, as you say in your own words, who do not conform to the ideal, these spaces become a place of struggle, which brings us to why we are having this conversation today. Last year, you published an essay titled Nadryw, Sprache, fühlen, healing language, published by socio-cultural, parts of which we will be reading throughout this episode today. In this essay, you try to unravel your experience as a child of war refugees and what it meant and means to grow up and live in Germany for you and your family.
There's so many layers to it, because I think, especially in today's discourse, we like to conflate, for example, the experience of migrant children, the experience of refugee children, or the experience even of like children who are raised German, who have German parents. And there's this need, because for the, so to speak, Mehrheitsgesellschaft, so the majority of the country, we're all the same. So we try to kind of become the same, which is for me very troublesome, because just because we all experience some sort of racism or discrimination doesn't mean we are a homogenous group. We are very heterogeneous. And there's, of course, things we share with, for example, migrant children, that we experience very similar experiences of racism and discrimination. But also when you're the child of refugees, you are raised with a certain subset of trauma that is very absent from the discourse. So when your parents have the TV on every day and you see, as a small child, you see dead bodies on the TV every day, you have your parents crying, the telephone ringing becomes this source of horror and terror, because every time the phone rings, it could be someone calling to tell you your friend, your family, someone close to you died, was murdered. There is this constant fear at home where you're stuck in this paralysis, which is very hard to get out of. And then you go to school, to a German school, in my case, for example, and it's not only that people around you don't understand what you're going through, they don't want to know. They sanction and punish you if you bring it up. If you read now the discourse on how overwhelmed teachers are, for example, with all the children of refugees because they don't speak the language, it's so hard for them. It's never like about how can we help children who are heavily traumatized? How can we help them become good citizens and healthy people? Because they've been through so much. They have parents who cannot provide for them in the same way, like emotionally provide for them in the same way. For example, people who don't have completely traumatized parents can, because they have seen horrors that nobody should see. And this isolation that comes from this experience, this you're not allowed to talk, essentially. Like at home, your problems, like I can't find friends, or oh, I'm so upset because someone was mean to me at school. There's no room or there's no space for these problems at home because your mom is in tears because someone was murdered again. There's no room for that because it's very hard for your parents to be like, oh, I just worked 12 hours, then I have to organize a protest, or I have to pack, maybe you know this, you have to pack boxes for people back home.
Yes.
A lot of people don't know how much time that takes, how much time my parents and like my family spend just packing boxes with food and clothes for people in Kosovo so they don't starve. To this day, there are people that come up to my parents, be like, thank you for back then giving us food because we would have died. And you can't talk, so you are constantly silenced at home. And at the same time, you have all this trauma, you have all these troubles, and you're not allowed to talk about this at school. And so all you learn is how to stay silent.
In the homes of war refugees, war is ever present. It begins at the threshold, the rounds of gunfire, the bombs, the crying drones from the television day after day. There is no age restriction on the news. There are no dewy-eyed children, only the same glazed-over look that gets passed on from one generation to the next. I'm still in kindergarten when I see my first corpse on television. I'm 10 when my father switches off the TV because American Beauty is rated for 12 and up. War begins at the threshold. War is not a state of emergency. War is our daily bread. War reminds us of our trespasses and to never forgive those who took our homes away from us. Life as the daughter of war refugees is not easy, but there are rules over which the country you grew up in and your parents are in agreement, and which you are expected to follow. There will be no complaining. You must be grateful. Whatever happens to you, it can never be as bad as that. Don't forget, you are allowed to live here. It's not a given. Where you grew up, if not where you belong, this is not your home. You're too German Albanian, not German Albanian enough.
To draw back to what you just said, most migrant children, especially those of us who grew up during the 1990s, we well know how our parents were torn by events in Kosovo, and Kosovo was taking most of the space in our social and family life. In your essay, you enlist a few rules that a daughter of refugees has to uphold as a woman in Germany, where your experience is disturbed by racism and otherness, between patriarchal expectations as well. How difficult is it to uphold these rules?
They are very difficult. Mostly because also there's this weird, and this is what fascinated me so much, there's this congruence between what society and your parents expect from you, even though they're from different sides. Like, you have to be grateful. Germans expect you to be grateful because they allowed you to be here. You do not have a right to live. You are granted living here. And your parents, for some reason, have the same subset. They're like, you have food, you live in safety, so why are you complaining? That's one big thing. You don't get to complain ever, neither at home, neither in school. So you live in this, I think subconsciously your parents reproduce a sort of the racism that you experience outside. Because I think in the essay I mentioned what my dad said, and that is the biggest, how is it translated in English? In German, it's der größte Verrat. For my dad, in a sense, he felt like a traitor because he had his children, so he couldn't do everything he could for his home country, so to speak. So for him, having children in a way was treachery, because he was like, oh, I have to take care of my children and I can't go and fight. I can't go and do everything I can for the people back home. So you live in this weird state of that the society in Germany mirrors this type of you should be grateful to be alive. And it's very hard now as a grown-up. Of course, you see there's a difference between racism in society and your parents' trauma. But as a child, all you recognize is patterns, right? There is this unwantedness in a way that is very hard to put into words. In a way, your parents contribute to racism without knowing. And that was, for me, the core of these rules was how everyone expects you to be a certain way. But it's never just a child. It's never just being human.
Dostoevsky created the words out of letters and familiar sounds as if he'd made a sandcastle. Nadryw is such an all-encompassing and understandable word that even the Germans wanted to use it themselves, though they couldn't translate it. So they left it, Nadryw. That's understandable. It's unlikely that a Bavarian from the Alps would experience a true Russian Nadryw. There's no reason to. The inner struggle, the breaking down of perfection. Kosovo clashes with my mother's memory. My mother clashes with my Germanness. My friends with my Albanianness. My identity is torn apart by the shards of the ideal.
You speak about unwantedness and also the difficulty of finding a language, or as you say, hard to put into words. In literature, as in life, we search for language that recuperates our experiences. You were born into exile, and though exile ended for Kosovo Albanians with the end of war in 1999, we have adapted to an exile consciousness. So to draw back to your essay, in your essay you ask, how do you search for language? You aim to deconstruct some understanding in the Russian word Nadryw, known from Dostoevsky's brothers Karamazov. It's what you call a language key, an attempt or a Heimatgefühl, a home feeling for you, or rather a place of struggle where your dialogues about home are made possible.
So I think in a way, once your parents fled, you will not experience home in a way other people do, because you're aware of the fact the only reason you live where you live, the only reason you have the life that you've lived is because so many people before you were murdered. That is the guilt and also the burden you bear always. You will always be the product of massacres and genocide. You can't undo that. This is your history. This is where you're from. And Nadryw for me it is so interesting to me because Nadryw actually, Dostoevsky made that word up himself. And for him, it was something so different. It was the experience of someone from the Russian aristocracy in a time where the aristocracy lost all its meaning. And the people in this class didn't know where they belonged anymore because they had no function to society. And this is what I love about literature, because even though that has nothing to do with me, it still perfectly encompasses the way I was raised or the way I felt, because I do not have a purpose in this society. I was not supposed to be in this society. The children of refugees do not serve a way of structure in this society because we were not supposed to exist. We are the outcome of everything that shouldn't happen. We are the outcome of everything that is unspeakable. And we live in this state of non-being, of non-belonging, because the moment, for example, this is what bothers me, by the way, a lot, is when a lot of Germans go, oh, you're German as well, because just because you're an immigrant or a refugee, you're still German. In a way, I get that. Like, in a way, I understand why it's politically important. But at the same time, it's like my parents had to flee because they were Albanians. So if I go and say, no, I'm not Albanian anymore, I'm German, I, in a way, am a continuity of the genocide. Because then I go, okay, Albanians don't exist anymore. I will just erase myself. In a way, this conundrum makes it very hard for you to arrive anywhere. And this in-between space, which actually, if you think about it, has always existed within humanity. but our really intense need to categorize everything so it's easily digestible makes our existence very hard. And then how do you look for the words if you say, like, I know I make the statement, like, there's no words for the unspeakable, but there have been so many people who in a way have experienced this and wrote about it. This is what always drew me to literature, because I think I told you this. Dennis Utlu once said, there is no scientific explanation how someone 200 years ago could have written a book and you now read it and you feel right at home. You feel like they get you. And that's the magic of it, because if you go beyond the insanity of categorization, if you go back to the humanity, to the real personal of what makes up a human, you will find that Dostoevsky, who was a Russian a couple hundred years ago, who had a widely different life than me, still in his heart felt something that I feel too.
War begins at the doorstep, but also ends there. The first language that exiled children learn is silence. It has its own vocabulary, not for reciting out loud, but to practice silencing. Its grammar doggedly lays itself on top of words and sees its usefulness in deception. Only its temporality is different. It reaches out and conceals instead of lending its words to what is happening. It is a language necessary for survival, for no one should know about the war that plays out beyond the doorstep. And in war, no one should know about the peace you experience on the other side. The silence is essential to not upset the norm.
So you speak about the power of literature to transcend time and borders, and a way to give words to experiences. What you say in your essay is that the experience of the child of war refugees is engulfed in silence. Is literature for you, or writing down this experience, an attempt to break the silence, to face this agony, and thereby to give form to your experience?
Yes, 100%. I like to say that every word is a reached out hand, an invitation to understand and to be understood. And that is, in the essay I say, I've never felt at home anywhere except on the Autobahn. Because like a lot of Albanian children, we sit in the car every summer for what felt like 300,000 years and drove to Kosovo from Germany and back. And it's interesting because in Germany, we were always the children of refugees. And in Kosovo, we're always the children of the so-called Shotsis. Again, we're still refugees, even though we are, allegedly in our homeland. So this place of going somewhere was the only place where I knew I was where I was supposed to be. And literature fills that hole, because literature is not something that is located on our place. It's always something that is in transit. It's always something like a book. It travels. It always travels through time. It always travels through geographically, and it always travels through minds. So literature in a way is this type of Autobahn. It's this in-betweenness, because there's this magic in it where a book is never finished until it's read. So I can write something, and especially with this essay, I've realized every time I talk to someone about it, they've read a different essay than I wrote, which is perfect and exactly how literature functions, because it shows you that no matter how close something is to you, it can transcend to someone else. And it creates this interconnectedness between people that for me is just magic, honestly. There's probably a psychological explanation, but I will just call it magic.
And I think it mirrors well in your experience and essay, which has as an underlying theme, Artlosigkeit. I'd like to use the German word for placelessness. To refer back to language, in your essay, you cite your sociology teacher who told you, if we don't master language, if the words are not familiar to us, how can we ever feel right? But are you proving your teacher wrong, that you can absorb the language and yet feel alienated in it?
That's such a good question. I was just thinking about, there's this phrase by Nietzsche where he says something very similar, where he says, if you cannot express your feelings, eventually you will stop feeling them. And I think in a way it's true and it's not true. Because I think what both conflate is you will feel something and you will still struggle to access it. If you can't find the right words for it, if you can't find any form of expressing it, you will in a way lose access to it. But at the same time, in psychology, we learn if you over-intellectualize stuff and you constantly put it into words for others to understand, you will lose access to it as well. Because everything you feel just becomes this concept, nothing that comes from within. So there's this dissonance that is created where on the one side you need someone to just get you in a way, but at the same time you need the freedom to express yourself. And there is not really a solution to it, which I think is very important to accept as people. That you will not find the end of language. You will not find the one way. There's no one way to find what you're feeling. And it's always a process. So in a way, I loved the quote from my teacher because in one way I was like, yeah, he's completely right. Because now that I can express all these things I've experienced, I find that I can access those emotions. But at the same time, I spend so much time to explain to other people how I've been feeling that sometimes I feel like it's not real anymore.
Something that happens in Kosovo with language, for us living in the diaspora, is that there is always a reference on our poor Albanian we speak. Gloria Zaldua speaks of linguistic terrorism and how to tame a wild tongue in relation to how language is judged with the expectation to conform to certain rules. And ironically, I stress ironically, do you feel as a cultural traitor in Kosovo because you do not speak the Albanian that the majority there expects you to speak?
I've written an essay called Against Understanding, in which I think there's one passage where I try to explain that there's like, when you grow up in a foreign country, you never have the authority over language. Because when I speak German and I use the words in a way that are not usual, people don't consider it artistic. People consider it as a symptom of me being the child of foreigners, and therefore I cannot properly speak. And the same goes for Albanian. If I make mistakes or whatever in Albanian, people are like, oh, it's because she's a Shazi. So you are always in this weird role where whatever language you speak, it does not belong to you. And in a way, that's why I never feel like a traitor when I'm there, because I feel like they don't want me. Like, I don't have the cultural position to be a traitor. I do not have the authority where I could be a traitor in that sense.
So just out of curiosity, what are your home tongues? What do you speak at home with your siblings and your parents?
So with my sister, this is for me the best explanation of how weird it is to grow up multilingual. Because my sister and I speak this weird mixture of English, Albanian, and German always. It's always like a sentence can start in one language and will traverse multiple countries until it reaches its finishing point. So there's no one language. There's just the desire to understand and be understood with my sister. With my parents, it's similar in the sense that we mix German and Albanian, even though my dad, for example, is very, very stingy about mixing languages. Like, he finds it very uncultured. I think for him, it's like a sign of not being educated properly if you mix languages, which I find hilarious, honestly, but okay. So with my dad, I try to have like either proper Albanian or proper German, and my mom doesn't care. My mom also like... I have this weird tendency where I find it hard to find the right word, so I will make sounds like a child, and she will get it.
So it proves your point, right? Language is felt.
Exactly. Like, I will say to my mom a sentence like, you know, mom, it felt like, yeah. And she will totally get what I just said. Like, she will understand it immediately, which shows to me that communication is more than just syntax and vocabulary. It's also knowing someone and feeling known.
The Albanians of the diaspora are Kanaks in Germany, are benefit recipients in Germany, illegal immigrants, refugees, Balkan whores, car thieves. Albania has the highest concentration of BMWs in all of Europe.
To go back again to your experience in Germany, something with which we kicked off this conversation quite strongly, but I think it's something that is actual and it deserves its attention. You mentioned how the migration or exiles or war refugee experiences are different. I always wonder about the Albanian experience within Germany, because in difference to the Turkish community, we are still considered as an extension of white, largely, not absolutely, which of course is not a prerequisite for non-racist experiences. But if you could, how would you place the Albanian experience within Germany? You don't have to answer if you have nothing to say in this regard.
I think that's such an important question because, for example, there are people from Kosovo that just emigrated way before the war. There are people in Germany from Kosovo who fled during the war. But then there are people like my parents who fled as political refugees before the war broke out. When I was younger, I thought everyone who had parents from Kosovo, all their parents were political activists like mine. I was very confused to find people who have no association whatsoever to the resistance. I was confused by this because I was like, what do you mean your parents didn't go to every protest and risk their lives every day? What do you mean they were just normal people? And that was very shocking to me because for me, I learned that being Albanian means to be resistant, to fight for freedom, to always fight for the right thing, to always protect people who are weaker than you. And then, of course, there's a whole nother level, and that is my parents both have university diplomas. My dad is a doctor. My mom studied economics. That's wildly different from people whose parents did not even have, for example, a higher education, or even who had to finish school after 9th grade because then they were forced to work at home. For example, my mom could go to university because she had an older brother who didn't go to university and worked so she could. And those are very different layers. Then again, I grew up in a home where my parents were in a way very liberal. But yeah, so I think that all these aspects and facets of the experience are very important to acknowledge and not assume, and this is what I find very important, not to assume that others were raised like you. I remember being on a panel last year where someone asked me about being the children of refugees and being successful in my field, and I said that my parents are both academics, they have a very good income, and they can support me very well. I am not at all an example of social mobility or the progress of anti-racism. Not at all. Because if I couldn't be successful as a cultural, someone who works in the cultural realm, then it would be insane. It would be completely insane if someone who's white, someone who has parents who can support her, would not be allowed any access, even though that was the case a couple of years ago. I'm not a success story in that sense because I'm way too privileged. You get what I mean?
I asked this question because it's important to provide a nuanced view about the Kosovo Albanian diaspora in Germany or the Albanian diaspora in Germany. Unfortunately, it is often viewed as a monolith, but our experiences are quite different from family to family, even though we occupy this space as Albanians. So this also gives us some insight to how it is for you, for your family, and how it might be different for many other families, and how we are a product of these experiences and our parents' experiences as well. So sorry for this monologue, but to change the subject, earlier in this conversation, you mentioned you are working on your first novel. Do you feel comfortable revealing more?
Yes, so I'm writing on a novel about forgiveness, which centers around something I am always surprised how unwilling people are to talk about it, and that is domestic violence. I talk about what the possibility is to reconcile with your parents when they've abused you when you were a child, what needs to happen. I think reconciliation and forgiveness is very important because I feel like as humanity, we have crossed borders that should have never been crossed. We have experienced cruelty and violence that should have never happened. You can't turn time around, right? You cannot undo everything that has happened, but you need to find a way to still live together. Like, for example, does it mean when your parents abused you when you were children that they didn't love you? I strongly disagree. But does that mean that every parent who hurts or abuses their child merits forgiveness? No. Again, I strongly disagree. And I think that, especially as the children of refugees, whenever we turn against our parents, where we try to cling to something outside the family, we feel like traitors. Because our families are under such pressure that you become this weird island. And I don't mean that only in German we would say bürgerlicher Faschismus, according to Adorno, so where you go like this, the primary family becomes this weird cell that needs to this is so funny because everyone knows that what happens inside the home should never be told outside. Like, this is a very universal experience for a lot of people. I think it gets even stronger when your parents are refugees or immigrants. And then, of course, you feel like you can't talk about it because there's so much racism that comes with that, where people who are German will just assume, oh yeah, of course, because they beat their children, because they're immigrants, because they're, I don't know, Muslims, because whatever the hot stereotype at the moment is. So you feel like you can't talk about this very traumatic thing because it will be fodder for racists. And this is this impossibility of talking about it is even what is the possibility for reconciliation and forgiveness when so many things have been done or so many things have happened that cannot be made undone, so to speak. How do you even fathom that, and how do you work through it?
And though this remain open-ended questions, I think it is such an important intervention for our community, particularly and especially because domestic violence is not only not seen as a problem, but unfortunately as a result as well, not talked about sufficiently. And as Hannah Arendt says, forgiveness is the only reaction which does not merely react, but acts anew. And to create along these lines as yourself means to scratch against a hard surface. So congratulations, Jonë, on the courage. I very much look forward to reading your book. This brings us to the end of this thought-enticing conversation. And a question that I ask every guest who accepts my invitation is, if you could bring one thing from Kosovo to Germany, what would it be?
Oh, wow, that's such a hard question. The people. Hannah Arendt once said this. She said, what do I care about? Was interessiert mich mein Volk? Mich interessieren nur meine Familie und meine Freunde, which translates to, I don't care about my people. I care about my friends and family. In a way, I relate to that in the sense that when you're a refugee or an immigrant, you get so reduced to what you are, your ethnicity, that you forget you're just some random person with random needs. I thought about this today so much that I haven't been in Kosovo for 2 years now, and I miss my family so much. And if I could, I'd just bring them closer to me somehow. And that's all I ever long for, the people I love.
That is very beautiful and a beautiful ending to this conversation. And also thank you, Jonë, for being here today. It was a pleasure to have this conversation with you today. Thank you.
Thank you so much again for your beautiful words and this beautiful conversation. I felt very appreciated.
How does someone look for language? I was maybe 8 when my mother first mentioned Daniel Steele's books, though never actually the books themselves, but rather where she herself appeared in them. She found herself in them so convincingly that I, at that age, think, Daniel Steele writes books about my mother. I'm not much older when I begin to look for someone who writes about me, whose words are like mirrors, whose thoughts help me to sort out my own.